I want to invite you this evening to open up to the book of Daniel. You can start in chapter 1. We'll eventually get to chapter 6 before we are done tonight. We'll start in chapter 1. We're going to talk a little bit about Daniel's life. When you read through the book that bears his name, you can't help but see that Daniel was a remarkable man. We first meet him in the pages of the Bible as a young man who had been taken into captivity by the Babylonians. And even then, he was faithfully serving the Lord. He was taking a stand for what was right. In chapter 1 and verse 8, it talks about the fact that Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. He wasn't going to do that kind of thing. And as you read through the book, Daniel may continue to age. He gets older as you go through the book, but his resolve to do the right thing, it remains constant. And so by the time we get to chapter 6, Daniel's not a young man anymore. In fact, at this point, he is an old man. At the very least, he is in his 80s. By the time we get there, he might be in his 90s at that point. And he had witnessed the changing of kingdoms. He had watched various administrations come on the scene and others leave the scene, so to speak. And all through the years, in the midst of all those changes, Daniel continued to faithfully serve the Lord, and the Lord continued to bless Daniel. Although Daniel was an old man by this point, he wasn't sitting back and enjoying retirement. That's not how it went. He was serving as an official in the administration of King Darius. I'm going to call him Darius. When I look at it, I want to call him Darius. I'm not going to lie about that. I think that's how it ought to be. But if I'm standing with the Bible open, for some reason it just comes out Darius because that's the way I've always heard it, and I think that's actually really how that's supposed to be. By the same token, though, Daniel ought to be Daniel, so I'm not really sure anymore. I give up. And so in verse 1, we read of Daniel chapter 6, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom," we're told. And what we're going to find as we look at this chapter is that those plans were threatened. They were threatened by the other high officials and the satraps because they didn't like the fact that Daniel had set himself apart, that he, because of his excellent spirit that he had within him, was more competent than they were in essence. And so even though Daniel was a highly trusted servant of Darius, he nevertheless became a victim of jealousy and men who were petty, who just sought to destroy him. And I like to say those kinds of things are uncommon, but I'm not sure that I can. We see that kind of thing take place in our day as well. And so as we study this evening, we're going to talk about the decree of Darius that resulted from this plot. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the devotion of Daniel that did not change even in the midst of difficult circumstances. And then finally we'll talk about the deliverance of God, without which these jealous and petty men would have succeeded in their evil plot. And so Darius, when you look back at the history of things, he began to reign when the Chaldean king Belshazzar was killed. All of this happened just as Daniel had prophesied. If you recall, many years earlier, back in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel had interpreted a dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had, that he saw a great image. And we're told in Daniel 2 and verse 32 that the head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. And these different sections of this image stood for different kingdoms. And at the end of chapter 5, we find that the Babylonian or Chaldean head of gold was replaced by the arms of silver. That stood for the Medo-Persian Empire. And the last 2 verses of that chapter say, verse 30 beginning of chapter 5, that very night Belshazzar the Chaldean was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom being about 62 years old. And so you've got a change taking place here. And what we learn at the beginning of chapter 6, as we read just a moment ago, is that Darius was a man with considerable organizational abilities. He organized the entire kingdom into these 120 provinces, and he placed satraps over each one of them. And a satrap is just a Persian way of saying governor. So basically, just think of it in those terms. You have these 120 governors, and then you have 3 high officials or administrators, of whom Daniel is one. And in addition to that, as we saw in verse 3, the king planned to set Daniel over the whole kingdom. He was going to be kind of at the top of the organization, so to speak. And so this organizational plan of Darius, Daniel's not going to just play a prominent role, he's going to play a preeminent role. And these other high officials and these governors, they didn't want that to happen. In fact, they conspired against him. They were going to prevent this from taking place. And we're not really told why they did that. It may have been nothing more than petty jealousy, which I'm sure you recognize as not uncommon. But I wouldn't be surprised if it had something to do with the fact that Daniel was an Israelite. Now, we don't know anything about these men who wanted to get rid of Daniel, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were either Medes or Persians. Maybe they simply were jealous of the fact that one of the Israelite captives was being considered as, the top administrator in the kingdom, a kingdom that they helped to conquer. I mean, he comes from a people who already conquered when we got here. He was conquered by the Babylonians. We conquered the Babylonians. Why is he going to be in this position? It doesn't really tell us exactly. But I'm confident that Daniel had a good reputation. After all, we're told, as we read earlier in verse 3, that Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because of this excellent spirit in him. One translation refers to this as his exceptional qualities. And you would expect among these exceptional qualities to be things like honesty and trustworthiness, things that would have served Darius well. And yet it's interesting to me that the other officials and the governors, what they did first, you see in verse 4, is it says they sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. Here's what that means. They were looking for evidence of corruption or of mismanagement somehow. We want to look for something that shows that this guy really isn't the guy who needs to be right under Darius at the top of the organizational structure of the Medo-Persian Empire. And what we're told is that there was none to be found. If you look at verse 4 also, they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. And of course, that didn't stop these guys. When they could find no reason to accuse Daniel that was legitimate, they decided to create one. And so in verse 5, we shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. And so since they couldn't find a real problem, they decided to create a problem. And it seems to me that there's a lesson in all of this for us. If someone is going to find something in your life to use against you, let it be that you're a faithful servant of God. Let that be the thing they can find against you. Isn't that the principle we see in this passage? And we also see that same principle in other places, I think. For example, in 1 Peter chapter 4, in verses 14 and following, Peter would say, if you are insulted for the name of Christ, you're blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, that is, not just because you wear the name, but because you live that life, let him not be ashamed. But let him glorify God in that name. Let that be the only thing somebody can use against you. And so the only thing the enemies of Daniel could use against him was his faith, and that's exactly what they did. They pretended that they wanted to honor the king, and yet what they actually did is they manipulated the king. They did it with ease because of his pride, because of his arrogance. He's the kind of guy who thought it sounded like a good idea when his highest officials came to him and said to him in verse 7, all the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes a petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. And Darius thought, man, that sounds like a great idea. I mean, who wouldn't think that's a good idea? Well, he's the kind of guy who does. And And so we're told, as one translation renders it, in verse 9, he put the decree in writing. It's amazing what people will do when pride enters into the equation, but that's what we have here. And once this decree was signed, Daniel had a choice to make, didn't he? He could have simply chosen to obey it. I wouldn't be surprised if there were many Israelites who were living in exile who did just that. They just obeyed the decree. We're not going to make any kind of petition to our God. And just didn't pray to him for a month. Would we have been different in that kind of situation? Would a decree like this be a problem for us today? I'm not sure it would be for everybody. And the reason I say that is because there are far too many Christians who can go for days and maybe even weeks without really praying to God. I mean, we know that Paul would say in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 2 that we are to, he said, devote yourselves to prayer. Or as he would say in 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 17, we ought to pray without ceasing. But how many of us have already become accustomed to living without that kind of thing? Wouldn't necessarily be a big deal for us. We wouldn't have to make any changes at all. Daniel wasn't like that, and he wasn't willing to do that. And so Daniel could have chosen to continue praying to God, just maybe doing that in secret. I don't have to obey the command, but I'm just going to make some changes in how I do this. And I'm sure he recognized that he didn't have to open his windows toward Jerusalem. That was his custom. And he didn't have to kneel down as he prayed, as was his custom. He could have continued praying to God by making a few changes so that no one else would know. I just keep the windows closed. I just pull the shade, so to speak, so that nobody knows what I'm doing. But Daniel understood that praying in secret like that would have looked a whole lot like he had placed the will of the king above the will of God. He wasn't willing to do that. He understood that you can't really be faithful to God while trying to give the impression that you're not trying to be faithful to God. I'm going to say that again because I think there's a principle there. You can't really be faithful to God by trying to give other people the impression that you're not trying to be faithful to God. And that's what that would have required from him. So if you're trying to give the impression that you're denying the Lord, let me tell you what you're doing. You're denying the Lord. That's what it is. That's what it comes out to. And so the Lord hasn't called us to serve him in secret while we just kind of blend into the crowd, so to speak. He wants us to declare our allegiance. He wants us to demonstrate that we are different. And I'll tell you, that's not easy. It's so much easier to blend in. And we know how to do that, don't we? We know how to blend in. And so we can go about our daily affairs in such a way that no one will ever suspect that we are servants of God, that we're Christians. And I'm not saying that we necessarily engage in the type of immorality that is so prevalent in our world around us, but the truth is that we sometimes fail to stand out. I want you to think for just a moment about something the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Philippi, Philippians chapter 2, and beginning in verse 12. He would say there, therefore, my beloved, as you've always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, so that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. And he says this, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life. If you walk in a dark room and you turn on the light, you can't help but notice a difference, can you? When the light shines, there is a clear difference. And the same thing is true when we shine as lights in this world, or at least it ought to be. There's no way for us to blend into the crowd and yet still shine as lights in the world. We can't be distinct like that when we just try to blend in. It's just not possible. And so if we look a lot like the people of the world in which we live, then we need to think about what that means. Why is that so? And is it supposed to be so? And what needs to be done about that? And so Daniel understood that the only real choice he had if he was going to be faithful to God was to do precisely what he had always done, to keep doing that. And so in verse 10, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went down to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem, and he got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. He just said, I'm going to stick to the plan. I'm going to do what I've always done. He knew that God was just as worthy of praise as he had ever been, and Daniel needed the Lord just as much as he ever did, and none of that had changed. And therefore, neither did his practice of praying to the Lord 3 times a day. So Daniel knew the cost of disobeying the Lord's decree, or the king's decree, rather. And I think he's willing to pay that price. And in fact, it looked like that's exactly what was going to happen. When the men who had set up Daniel brought it to the king's attention that he had disobeyed, they also reminded the king that he couldn't change his decree. That's just not how it worked among the Medes and the Persians. He didn't want to throw Daniel to the lion's den, but it was the law. And so in verse 16, the king gave the order. They brought Daniel. They threw him into the lion's den. And the king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." I hope he does, because I can't. That's basically what he's saying. I'm confident Daniel believed that God was capable of delivering him. But he was committed to serving him one way or another. He chose to put God first because it was the right thing to do, not because he knew what the outcome would be. He didn't have that. This was not something that was told to him. If you just do the right thing, it's all going to turn out okay. He didn't have that told to him. And in that way, he was kind of like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that we read about earlier in the book, in chapter 3, when Nebuchadnezzar, when they defied his decree many years earlier, when the king threatened to throw them into the furnace. Do you remember what they said to him in Daniel 3, verse 17? "If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace." God can do that. "And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king." That was their conviction, actually. But look at verse 18. "But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Our God can do it, and we believe he will do it, but if he doesn't do it, we're still not changing. We're going to do the same thing. They knew that God was capable of delivering them, but they're willing to give their lives. So does God always deliver his people? You read through the book of Daniel, and it happens quite a bit. It happens with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego there. Happens with Daniel in chapter 6. God steps in, and he doesn't let the plans against these people stand. And what you find when you read, throughout the rest of the scriptures is it doesn't really always work that way. In a sense, yes, God does always deliver his people, but it's not always in this life, is it? And so this story isn't telling us that really all we have to do is just serve God and everything is going to go our way. That's not the message that we're supposed to get out of all of this. That's not the point. In fact, for every time that God has chosen to deliver his servants, I suspect that we could go and find other examples where there was no such deliverance. In Hebrews chapter 11, take a minute to go over there. The writer of Hebrews would go through all of these folks who lived their lives by faith and set out their example. But towards the end of all of that, he kind of goes quickly through a number of people and a number of situations. And in verse 32 of Hebrews 11, he says, "And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel, and of the prophets who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions." I wonder who he's talking about there. "Quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth." He says, you know what? Yes, there were some who were delivered, but there were a lot of others who were not. That's the point, isn't it? But guess what they did? They still lived by faith. They didn't back down. And we certainly see that God is capable of delivering his people, but we also find that he doesn't always do that, not on this side of eternity. And so the thing is, we have to choose to serve him one way or another, don't we? Because whether or not he's worthy of our allegiance, it doesn't change by whether or not he steps in and and, doesn't let that take place. He's worthy of our allegiance when things are going well for us, and he is worthy of our allegiance when they are not. Daniel understood that, I think. He knew he served a God who was ultimately in control. And that's one of the great lessons we learn from the book of Daniel. And what our responsibility is to be faithful to him and to do that regardless of the consequences, to stand firm in our faith. So the question tonight for you is this: is that something you're willing to do? It is so easy when we come together on occasions like this. We come together. We have people who share the same faith. We even got the doors locked out there, and keep somebody from coming in and doing something weird. And so we're pretty set here. But what if we weren't? Would we continue to be faithful? If we had to, as the saying goes, we had to have skin in the game, we still serve the Lord? Not necessarily easy to do so. But let me tell you what, there is no question in my mind that it is worth it. And that's a message we see all through Scripture. If God had not delivered Daniel, would God have been any less worthy of his service? No, not at all. Same thing with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're willing to give up their lives because they knew that God is God. They knew that he should be served. And they knew that no one else fit that description. Nothing else fit that description. Who are we? How faithful are we? How faithful would we be if it was put to the challenge? If it cost us something to exercise our faith? Those are questions I think we need to ask. We may have someone here this evening who owes some duty to God. Maybe you have never obeyed the gospel of Christ. You've never openly, confessed Jesus as Lord and then put that into practice by the way that you live. You need to do that. Not only believe and repent of sins and confess, but to be buried with Christ in baptism, so you can have a new life when you come up out of those waters. And if you've done that, but maybe you haven't been living the kind of committed life that we've been reading about this evening. These things that we read, whether it's in the Old Testament or the New Testament, all of them were written for our instruction. We're intended to learn something about what it means to be a servant of God, what it calls upon us to do. And there are some challenging things that we read about in the pages of Scripture. And it's sometimes hard for us as we look at those things that are challenging to apply them today, because it just seems like our situation is so different from theirs. But I tell you what, we need to do it. We need to have that kind of faith, that whether things are going well or whether they're not, that we serve God and we do it faithfully. So if you're here tonight and you owe to him some duty, if we can help you with that, we ask you to come as we stand and as we sing.
Have thine affections